Well, hello. We'll just informally start and then really start in a few minutes. My name is Christine Emmert. I live in Valley Forge. So a lot of you I've probably seen or will see around town. I shop at the Acme and all that. Get my gas down here in Phoenixville, I guess, is my town. I am a volunteer for Hopewell Furnace. It's a national park, and how many of you have been to Hopewell? Oh, well, you all know. Hopewell was part of the ironworking industry, and you're going to ask, what does that have to do with suffragettes, etc.? Originally, we only did one play from Hopewell, called From Out the Fiery Furnace. I don't know if you have seen it. I wrote it.
Yes,
And
we saw you.
yes, Barbara Hannevig, who is not here tonight, is the actress that I wrote it for, and she did it here at Phoenix Public Library about 2-3 years ago. And this play is a story of a woman who actually lived at Hopewell and her connection with the Hopewell stoves. The stoves, which are very beautiful pieces of art, but are also great cooking things. This play, which is not really a play, I call it an entertainment. You can tell me what you think. Please use nice words when we're done. But I call it a work in progress. The first, I guess, incarnation I did of this was for the League of Women Voters in Chester County at someone's house. They wanted somebody to do Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I had just been up at Seneca Falls with the stove play. And I had bought Elizabeth Cady Stanton's memoirs. So I didn't even have to write a script. I just read from her memoirs. It was great. And then I realized that a lot of people do not know how hard it has been for women to get the vote. We do not appreciate what these women went through, and God knows I don't want to go through it. It was very, very, very difficult. Only one person, and I'll talk about this in the play, you'll hear it again, from the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights in 1848, lived until 1920 when the amendment was passed. And she was the one woman who had fought all that time, who was still alive, who could cast her vote. And so we are really fortunate. So on voting day, please vote. I don't say vote often and vote early or whatever, but please do vote. Okay. Hopewell Furnace, to get back to the link between the two, was a place when it was in business, so to speak, where women were treated with equality. It was indeed very strange by those standards. They could hold any job, if they could do it, that men could hold, and they were paid exactly the same money. So they had a vested interest in supporting women's rights to do things. Of course, when the furnace fell apart and they went back years later and started doing the Park Service thing, they didn't allow women in there at all, but that's all changed now. We're back to women being part of the park. A lot of wonderful men, and I'm saying this for the men here, because this is not a man-bashing thing, have really supported women through the years. And I talk about some of them. Mark Twain, you'll get to hear my terrible Mark Twain imitation, is one of the people that was actually a supporter of women's rights. Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure you've all heard about, So we are looking at a vast group of people here. And with that, I will slide into the beginning of this by introducing this poor, sad little book that we just realized is 60 years old. 60 years old. This was my civics book in high school. My aunt gave it to me. My aunt gave me all my books. She was wonderful. And it has my scribblings from 10th grade in it, when I had a whole different name and a whole different style of writing. But these are all the documents, they say, by these words, it's called, that make our country, the laws. Sadly, there is nothing in here that is attributed to a woman, which is sad. But I take this, and from this I read the Constitution for the first time. Now, I have a question for you. How many of you watch Jeopardy? Anybody? Oh, I watch it. I mean, come on. It's okay to admit you do if you do. There was a question on Jeopardy years ago. Where is the word sex mentioned in the Constitution? And it applies to tonight in the 19th Amendment. The little amendment that changed the lives of women everywhere. And I want to read you the 19th Amendment. Ratified August 26, 1920. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Just a few simple words. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how we got there. I used my script. My husband keeps telling me I should have memorized this whole thing by now, but I don't want to get the dates wrong and I don't want to get the words wrong because they're very important. The first thing I want to read to you is a very interesting remark by Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. 50 years after it was written, she remarked, "It is the cliche of our own time that women spend half a century fighting for rights and another half wondering whether they wanted them at all. Rights have a dull sound to people who've grown up after they've been won." Okay, very wise thing Betty Friedan said. So we're going to try to take the dull sound out and put a little music back into it by reading first a poem by Maya Angelou, who I'm sure we all miss her wisdom. It's a poem she wrote called Phenomenal Woman, and I couldn't read it half as well as she did because she got a lot of beat in it, and I'm not that good at that part. But she said, "Pretty women wonder where my secret lies, because I'm not cute or built to suit a fashion model's size. But when I start to tell them, they say I'm telling lies. I say it's in the reach of my arms and the stride of my step and the curl of my lips. I'm a woman, phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me. I walk into a room just as cool as you please, and to a man, the fellows stand or they fall down on their knees and then they swarm about me like a hive of bees. I say it's the fire in my eyes and the flash of my teeth and the swing of my waist and the joy in my feet. I am a woman, phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me." So now you understand just why my head's not bowed. I don't have to shout or walk about or have to talk real loud. that when you see me passing, it ought to make you proud. I say it's the click of my heels and the bend of my hair and the palm of my hand and the need of my care. I'm a woman, phenomenal woman. That's me. Okay, that is today. Here we are, rights in place, head tall, but I want to give you some quotes that address the problems we had getting here. The first one refers to the title. Freedom is fragile and must be protected. To sacrifice it even as a temporary measure is to betray it. And that's Germaine Greer. There never will be complete equality until women themselves help make the laws and elect the lawmakers. Susan B. Anthony. Women want rights more than they got. Why don't they just take them and not be talking about it? Sojourner Truth. History, his story, is her story too. Anon. I would venture to say that Anon, who wrote so many poems, signing them not, was often a woman. Virginia Woolf. Men were taught to apologize for their weaknesses and women for their strengths. Lois Wise. Every time we liberate a woman, we liberate a man. Margaret Mead. A woman is like a tea bag. It's only when she's in hot water you realize how strong she is. Eleanor Roosevelt. These quotes came from wise women of the past who fought conventions to give us our place at the convention. We owe them much, and we must not let their words be forgotten. Abigail Adams, who warned her husband when he was writing the very outline of this country, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Women who fought for the vote were called suffragists here and suffragettes in England. Of course, the terms have now grown together. But it is a word that has suffering implicit in it, both of them. The word suffrage in the Middle Ages was a kind of prayer. It comes from the late 1300s. It's French, suffrage. Excuse my French. It was enlarged over time to mean requests for assistance and finally to mean the active seeking of the vote itself. Well, can we forget how much suffering there was? Women were spit on, locked up, assaulted, beaten, all because they asked for equality with men. And we only have a short time to summon up some of the spirits of these great ladies to remind us that freedoms are fragile and they have to be guarded as a treasure unburied from the past. Oh, here come some of those voices directly. One of them was a symbol of all we went through, Lucy Burns. Maybe you have heard of the Night of Terror. Well, as though there were only one night of terror where women's suffrage was concerned. Brave women who asked for what every white man was given by the nature of his anatomy, the right to vote. Alice Paul and myself we not only marched before, but we had done hunger strikes in England where we met. But nothing prepared us for November 15th, 1917. Our government had us arrested for picketing the White House. And they took us ladies to an abandoned workhouse in Ottawa, Virginia, where they assaulted us, beat us. They hung me up by my handcuffs to a cell overnight. Our guards, who were all good family men, needed to be guarded themselves, and many women raised their hands over their heads to join with me in the manner of being shackled. Oh, and when the night was over and the madness of the night passed, we went on a hunger strike. Oh. And they took us and force-fed us like prisoners in a mental ward. I thought that night, many nights after, when I was being held down by these men and tubes thrust down my throat, of what Emmeline Pankhurst once said, "Be militant in your own way. Those of you who can break windows, break them. My last word is to the government. I incite this group to riot. Take me if you dare." No matter what pain I went through, I could not let my sisters down. When the vote was finally won, I walked away tired and happy for the few years left for me to live my life, knowing that I had fought. I had won equality, not only on paper, but also in my heart. Rest well, Lucy, and Alice. We have not forgotten you. You have many sisters in arms that were marching for suffrage and being, shall I say, manhandled in the process. But it wasn't just our sisters like Lucy Burns, who grew up and were educated in Yale, or grew up in a well-to-do family like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We meant equality for everyone. And some did not agree. At the Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio, 1851, it took a woman who had been a slave to remind us that freedom applied to all. Sojourner Truth, previously known as Isabella Baumtree, took exception to the notion equality was for the educated and the white. She stood up and declared, "Ain't I a woman?" Well, chillin', there's so much racket, there must be something out to kill her. I think the Twigs and Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all this talking about rights, white men are going to be in a fix pretty soon. That man over there, he says women need to be helped out of carriages and carried over ditches. No one helps me out of a carriage or carries me over a mud puddle, and ain't I a woman? Look at me. You just look at my arm. I have plowed, I have planted with the best of them. Oh, no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? My cup won't hold a pint and yours holds a quart. Would you be mean not to let me have my little amount half full? And that man, oh, they're black, he says, women can't have rights like men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. There ain't nothing a man in him at all. The first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone. these women together ought to be able to turn it back. And now they's asking to do it, men better let them. Oh, I'm obliged to you for hearing me. And now old Sir Joyner, and she got nothing more to say. There was a long timeline between the wish and the reality of voting equality. The first proposal to the Congress for a constitutional amendment was in 1878. Although it did not become law, states took it upon themselves to write their own laws of equality of the sexes for the right to vote. Montana and other places did this, but the first one was in Wyoming, where voting became legal to women when Wyoming was only a territory, 1869, and it continued to be a law when Wyoming became a state. The first national entity to pass elective franchise was the Isle of Man, 1881, followed by New Zealand, 1893, Australia, well, except for the Aboriginals, 1902. Just as a footnote, Australia did not give everyone the right to vote until the 1960s. Okay, after Australia, Finland, 1906, Norway, 1913, Austria, Canada, and Germany, 1918, Iceland and Denmark, 1919. The United States, 1920. Although some states, like Montana and Wyoming, had made it state law before then. France, 1945, and Liechtenstein, 1984. So many women who campaigned for this right did not live to see it become law. I'm thinking of Lucretia Mott, known for her toils on the part of the abolition of slavery as well as women's rights. She lived a long crusading life, 1793 to 1880, and was one of the first people to help in the creation of Swarthmore College. She felt it was the duty of women to secure themselves the right to elective franchise. Her voice wasn't so strident, and she didn't leave many writings. But she was an attendee at that landmark convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, and impressed no lesser luminary than Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott kept striving, she kept listening to the still small voice within her, and taking the voice to protest all inequality. Lucretia said publicly, "The world has never seen a truly great and virtuous nation, because in the degradation of women, the very fountains of life are poisoned at their source." Those were her public words, and they were very brave words. She made them against the conservative elements of the Friends meeting. When a schism occurred, Lucretia sided with the progressive side, the Hicksites as they were called. And Susan B. Anthony, another Quaker, well, she wasn't quite so passive. She was arrested for casting an unlawful vote during an election. Susan, who was always a Quaker, grew up in Rochester, and she went to the Rochester's First Unitarian Church when she was an adult. And she proved a louder voice that cried out, "It is we the people, not we the white male citizens or we the whole people. Everyone formed the Union. Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Susan's father had been an abolitionist, and she took on his cause, but then he supported her when she expanded this to include equality in wages, the right for women to take charge of their own lives. And she worked tirelessly with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. 75 to 100 speeches a year she gave in support of her views. She died in 1906, not seeing the passage of the amendment for voting rights, but she's been quoted as saying, "It will come. Failure is impossible." It's on a little mug that I have when I did this up at the Susan B. Anthony house. I drink my tea from it every morning and see her not so smiling face, but her beautiful words. Okay, Frederick Douglass, he added his masculine voice to the cry. Voting should not be limited by race or gender. And of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who traveled around the country talking about rights for everyone. I would have girls regard themselves not as adjectives, but nouns. Elizabeth did all this in spite of living in a happy family situation with a husband who did not agree quite as much as she did about the place of women. And she brought her children up progressively, of course. And she gave a speech called Solitude of Soul to the Committee of the Judiciary of the United States Congress, January 18th, 1892, in which she said, "Whatever the theories may be of women's dependence on man, in the supreme moments of her life, he cannot bear her burdens. Alone she goes to the gates of death to give life to every man that is born into the world. No one can share her fears or mitigate her pangs, and her sorrow, and it's greater than she can bear. She passes through the gates into the vast unknown. Who, I ask you, can dare to take on himself the rights, the duties, the responsibilities of another soul?" Mark Twain himself spoke up for the dignity and equality of women as voting citizens in 1901 when he said, and you'll have to excuse my Mark Twain, it's not as good as Hal Holbrook, even when he was alive. Okay, referring to a woman's sphere in life, I'll say a woman's always right. For 25 years, I've been a woman's rights man. I have always believed, long before my mother died, that with her gray hairs and admirable intellect, perhaps she knew as much as I did. Perhaps she knew as much about voting as I did. Oh, others marched. March 1913, 5,000 to 8,000 women who were attacked at the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, kicked, spat on, slapped, beaten. The army troops were called to the scene, and still women were not discouraged from picketing the Wilson White House. And when the 19th Amendment was finally passed, August 18, 1920, it had been sent on a round of the states for approval. But even then, its acceptance rested on a woman, the mother of Henry T. Byrne, who was a Republican representative from McMinn County, Tennessee. He did not support the amendment, but he received a note from his mother, which read, "Now don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." Mrs. Cat was, of course, Carrie Chapman Cat, who headed the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Henry was a good son. He did what his mother asked. Carrie Chapman Cat, the cat who put the rat in ratification, had spoken to every mother and son's heart when she said in 1916, "Shall we play the coward then, and leave the hard knocks for our daughters? Or shall we throw ourselves ourselves into the fray, our own shoulders to the blows, and thus bequeath to them politically liberated womanhood. The veins of American women are not filled with milk and water. Women found themselves with elective franchise granted. The whole country stood up, taller, stronger as a nation, because women were added to its voice. As Marian Anderson, the famous singer, remarked, "No matter how big a nation is, it is no stronger than its weakest people, and as long as you keep a person down, some part of you has to be there, down, to hold him down." It was an acknowledgement of Samuel Johnson's statement centuries before, that, well, men know that women are an overmatch for them. Therefore they chose the weakest and most ignorant. But now we look at women differently. So much was written and rhymed and drawn as cartoons for the suffrage. Postcards were created, and in London, women drew announcements on the pavements about when the meetings were to be held. Drawing on the pavements at that time was punishable by 7 days in jail. But one such postcard from that time, which I especially liked, was entitled "Votes for Women," and it has a young woman leaning towards a young man, and the words, seemingly hers in the little cartoon, say, "For the work of the day, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey, we want something to say." More work follows, though, even after the 19th Amendment was passed. Hillary Rodham Clinton, who thrived in a country where women were allowed political equality, said at a World Convention in China for Women, 1995, "The history of women has been a history of silence. Women's rights are human rights." I return you to the quotation that I started with to remind you how vital it is to continue exercising our right to vote and honor all those. Freedom is fragile, as Germaine Greer wrote. Freedom is fragile, must be protected. To sacrifice it, even as a temporary measure, is to betray it. Maybe we need a new quotation for our equality in the world, assuming that we guard this fragile freedom. As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, my country is the world. Virginia Woolf. But in conclusion, I bring you the thoughts of the new woman with her rights intact in a commencement speech to the graduating class of Wellesley by Barbara Bush in 1990. And you have to forgive my Barbara Bush. It's not even as good as my Mark Twain. I'm really thrilled to be here today and very excited. These are exciting times. They are exciting in Washington, and I have really looked forward to coming to Wellesley. I thought it was going to be fun. I didn't realize how much fun. Wellesley, you see, it's just not a place, but an idea, an experiment, an excellence in which diversity is not just tolerated, but it is embraced. The essence of this spirit was captured in a moving speech about tolerance given last year at the student body president of one of your sister colleges. She related a story by Robert Fulghum about a young pastor finding himself in charge of some very energetic children, and he hit upon a game called Giants, Wizards, and Dwarfs. Now you have to decide, the pastor instructed the children, which you are, a giant, a wizard, or a dwarf. Well, at that, a small girl was tugging at his pants and asked, "Where do mermaids stand?" Well, the pastor tells her there are no mermaids. "Oh, yes, there are," she said. "I am a mermaid." Now, this little girl knew what she was, and she was not about to give up either on her identity or the game. She intended to take her place wherever mermaids fit into the scheme of things. So, where do mermaids fit into the scheme of things? Where do mermaids stand, all those who are different, those who don't fit into the boxes and the pigeonholes? At the end of your life, you will never regret not having passed one more test, not winning one more verdict or closing one more deal. We are in a transitional period right now, fascinating and exhilarating times, trying to adjust to changes and choices that we, men and women, are facing. The controversy ends here, but our conversation is only beginning, and a worthwhile conversation it has been. May your future be worthy of your dreams. Thank you. Thank you. Being as this is a Hopewell presentation, we always have a question and answer session, if you want it, after the performance. I'm not sure I can answer all your questions, or any of your questions if you have them, but we usually at least ask for one. And I know that one very smart person said once after a very long presentation, "When can we leave?" That was his question. I hope that won't be the first question, but do you have any questions?
I recall watching Ken Burns' program on Prohibition, and I remember some connection with the women's rights movement.
There was, yes, Carrie Nation and that whole thing.
Can you, I know I heard it, but I don't remember what I heard.
Oh, well, women who were home, and mostly, well, not just lower class economically, had a lot of problems with the men going out and drinking and, spending all the money and not taking care of the children and, frankly, domestic violence. So they threw their lot in with the prohibitionists. Yes, they did. They were very much against alcohol. I think that's changed now. Yes, that was a big concern at the time. It was also a real problem with the people that were for rights for African Americans, because at some point they felt that it was too much to ask the country to do both at once. And so in many cases, the two ideas split between, African American rights and women's rights. But you still had a group that crossed the lines there. Susan B. Anthony being one of them. There's a beautiful, if you go to Rochester, New York, there's a beautiful park where they have a statue, two statues, sitting on a bench of Frederick Douglass talking to Susan B. Anthony. They're absolutely lovely. Go in the spring, it's just gorgeous. Or when the snow stops, whichever comes first. Okay, yes.
Apropos of this subject, just last night I saw on MSNBC, they were talking about Oregon, and the governor had to resign because of some scandalous thing having to do with his girlfriend, and they don't have a lieutenant governor, so I think it's the attorney general took over governorship, and then everybody moved up, and it's 4 women that are in charge of the state now, and they can vote by mail. Already they were doing that, and she, the woman now that's the governor, I think she was the attorney general, and she already had a bill for people to be able to vote through the DMV. I don't know whether it's just when you get your license, but they have everybody's name and address, and they will send this out saying that you can vote. If you choose not to, you can say I don't want to, but otherwise everybody's going to be able to vote out there.
Good for
really-
Oregon.
It was very encouraging, very inspiring.
Yes.
I'm not sure, Jeannie, everybody's gonna be able to vote.
Well,
Registered to vote.
To register.
Automatically
Registered.
women. Yes.
To register to vote.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that they've also had some thoughts about, some countries make it a holiday
Mhm.
so that you don't have to run before you go to work or after you get home, but you actually, and there are countries where it is illegal not to vote. So, I believe, when my sister was married to an Italian who's Franco since died, and they moved back to the United States, but when he was in Italy, he had to vote. Yeah, it was required. So, yes.
What was the percentage of, what do you think the percentage of women that were against the vote?
Oh, a lot.
Yeah,
A
I
lot.
assume there was, because these were probably the rebel-rousers that wanted the vote.
Well, this was scary for a lot of people.
Yes.
It changed your life. It did.
Mhm.
And a lot of women just voted the way their husbands wanted them to
Uh-huh.
vote. You see that in Downton Abbey, if you watch that with, whatever, the Dowager, where she says, you know, she said, you have sex feelings when your mother tells you you can have them, and, you know, you vote what your husband says. So, yeah, it's not done yet either. I mean, we have people that want to take the rights away,
Mhm.
and you have to be careful. You can't get too complacent. As
No.
Betty Friedan says, it has a dull sound to people who didn't grow up, you know, fighting for these things. I mean, I often think, why did we burn our bras? You know, when I see some of the ways that young women are now becoming sex objects again. And it's so sad, because some of them don't have to be that. They're so beautiful and wonderful.
Mhm.
But that's the way life is, you know, you don't always, progress is a fight.
Yes.
So, we're fighting.
Yes. I don't think the young girls are though.
Well,
Some
some
of them
are,
are.
they really are. Here's one.
Well, just a word that came to mind from my history classes in high school was coverture. You know, when you were describing that, and I wondered if you could speak to that, or if you were familiar with the terminology and how it was used to pish-posh, you know, when women were originally trying to win the vote.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but I can't remember what the context was, who it was that was speaking out against the right of women to vote, but the logic was basically that women are already
Well, Queen
given.
Victoria didn't believe in it. She was queen. I mean.
But it was, the legal logic from whoever was speaking was that women are presumed to have influenced their husband's vote, therefore they are in a way voting through the principle of coverture.
Like secondhand smoke.
Right, like their husband's vote is also speaking for them, but the specific term he used was coverture, and I've never heard it used in a different.
That's an
context.
interesting one.
Yeah,
I'll
that
have to
was
put it
the,
in here somewhere. I told
the
you it's a
legal
work in
bracing
progress.
of the terminology.
I did not mention, by the way, and after I brought this specifically, because somewhere I'm gonna find the page, two women ran for president before women had the right to vote. Victoria Woodhull and Belva Lockwood. Two women that believed that they had the right. And they had parties and they got votes. They did. So it wasn't all horrible. And I wanted to say something about Jeanette Rankin. I don't know if you know who she is. And Lawrence O'Donnell was talking late night at one point, and he mentioned her, and I sat up straight because I had even forgotten about her. She was the first woman elected to Congress. And she was the only one in the First World War and Second World War to cast a vote against going to war. Because she said, you know, our country is too young, we cannot spare the blood of our young men. And no matter how important you feel those wars are, she did have a point of some kind. it's something a woman would think about, being a mother, you know. Okay, anybody else? Yes?
Mine's a lot easier than my wife's was. It's been, I'm recollecting like 22 or 23 years ago. I grew up in this area from Coatesville. And Coatesville has Luke and Steel, well, the former Luke and Steel. We used to supply the metal for Hopewell via train during, and you know, log, however they transported it up there to make cannonballs for the Revolutionary War. And I remember being a kid going on tours there, and I remember being a teenager having the history, you know, lesson kind of tour, which is a little bit different. It was more grown up. I don't remember, like, you know, the detail of it being, like, you know, so equal, like the way it was, like 22 years ago.
Yeah,
Is
they
it
didn't
like
point
that
that
now?
out, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
they-
I'm quite interested in it. It's a neat point of history. 'Cause
Well,
I haven't heard that side.
it is a very unique point in history. But I think, I mean, there were many forges.
Right.
If you go around, you will see
There's
there are
different rail
quite a
lines
lot.
too, yeah.
Hopewell was one of the more important ones. It had about, at its height, something like about 1,000 people that
Yeah.
were part of the community around there. I don't know that these people were great liberators, but they needed help. They needed workers. And I mean, they had if you see our stove play, they had runaway slaves that came through and stopped and worked there. They were far enough away from Philadelphia and all these other places that they could be pretty much autonomous.
So it was
And-
production the motivator and the liberation in that case?
Sorry.
Was the production of, you know, the goods the motivator of the liberation in that place where everyone was equal simply because they needed to produce?
Yeah, it was a hard life, very hard. I mean, women didn't have it easy because they were working, some of them as hard as men. They were woodcutters and molders and having children, which
Yeah, on top of that, yeah.
at that time was a big cause of death.
I've seen
I
that
mean, there
place.
was tuberculosis there was malaria. Their work staff, let's say, changed real fast.
Yeah. And I can see where the liberation, the employment angle could have been influenced by the need for production, but the equal pay.
Yeah, that's unheard of. Yeah,
Right.
it's- I was really
Well,
surprised
they
they
also,
heard
they
that.
also had interracial marriages at that time.
No, a doppelganger, yeah.
Yes,
So much.
So
and
that
the
was
children were
there.
schooled together too, all the
Yeah.
children.
Yeah, there's so much,
So,
they were very
They were
forward
kind of ahead of their
thinking.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
by
who
hundreds of
settled
years.
there?
Significantly.
Yeah.
Who settled in the Hopewell area?
Germans and the British and the Irish.
I wonder who influenced it, it's different.
Mark Bird was, I believe, of British descent. He started Hopewell Furnace, and he was a slave owner. But there is a theory, I don't know if I agree with it, but that the slaves that he had came from Kenya, what is now Kenya, where they did a lot of iron work, and that he used their knowledge to help start the forges there. That's what the other our superintendent who just left, Edie Sheen Hammond, has that as one of her theories of why there was such good iron work from Hopewell. But they made arms during the Revolution, and about the Civil War,
Yeah.
everything
That was the
went
taper.
away, you know.
Yeah.
So it wasn't, they couldn't convert. They were doing I'm not really good technically with this, but they were doing the forges by charcoal, and they
green
never
sand,
made
yeah.
the
They cast
transition
them
to
with
coal.
sand molds
Yeah.
and-
So they kind of faded away after that. But you can talk to a lot of the people that work at Hopewell. They're much more knowledgeable than I am.
Do they still do the casting there for the children? I remember being a kid and like you were allowed, when I was in high school in Coatesville, like the girls and the boys both took home ec and metal and wood shop, and one of the things everyone learned how to do was casting green sand. And when we went to take our class trips to Hopewell, they let, you know, at the time we were teenagers, cast and green sand. We weren't allowed to handle the hot liquid metal, but we were allowed to make our mold and pound it down, and everyone thought that was a great
I
thrill.
don't think you're still allowed
Wait,
to
I
do
mean,
that.
22 years ago. You can still do that.
Well,
You're lucky, when I was in school, we got some home ec.
Anything but.
Oh,
I can cook and I can cast something that's apparently obsolete.
see how much it advanced from the time I went to school to the time you went to school?
yes, we're on a roll here. Getting better every year.